Good evening, and welcome to our series, Conversations About Landscape, Hidden Nature, SF. My name is Susan Schwartzenberg, and I'm the Director of our Environment Programs at the Bay Observatory at the Exploratorium. Our work explores the built and natural landscape at our amazing site on the urban edge of San Francisco Bay, and how we might decipher our human impacts. Our work is centered on climate change and the regional efforts underway to mitigate and adapt to the climate challenges we face here in the Bay Area. We work with a range of professionals and local communities to do our work. Among our colleagues is our local Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, who worked with us on a land acknowledgement, which I will share with you, but our work continues to consider a much longer working partnership with our Ohlone partners. The area known as San Francisco was once the home of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the original peoples of this land, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place. The Exploratorium is located on their lands and waters. We are thankful to our Ohlone collaborators for their generosity in helping us develop a stronger understanding of our connection to this place. The Exploratorium invites you to share in our appreciation and respect for the Ramaytush Ohlone, whose perspectives and knowledge of the local environment continue to inspire us toward a more sustainable and resilient future together. Please take a moment to consider where you are. Here in San Francisco, we think about the waters of San Francisco Bay, the human-made shoreline, its structures, and the hills beyond. Think about where you are, the places you love, where you're from, and reflect on the history of those lands. Tonight, I have the pleasure of welcoming our friends from San Francisco Estuary Institute, who have been working with us in a series of partners, including the Presidio Trust, who's here tonight, and a member of the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, on a project to reveal the subtle and extraordinary ecology of the San Francisco landscape. I'd like to introduce our three primary speakers, preceded by a small introduction by Robin Grossinger, the director of the Resilient Landscapes Program. Our three speakers will be Sean Baumgarten. His research with San Francisco Estuary Institute's Resilient Landscape Program focuses on the historical ecology of California ecosystems using archival data to reconstruct the form and function of past landscapes and understand how they have changed over time. Over the past 2 years, Sean has led SFEI's study of San Francisco historical ecology through the Hidden Nature SF project. Greg Castro is Salinan, Rumsian, and Ramaytush Ohlone and has been involved in the preservation of his cultural heritage for 3 decades. Greg is a member of the Society for California Archaeology and co-facilitator for the annual California Indian Conference, a 30-year gathering about Indigenous heritage. He is a writer and activist, and he's involved in countless projects, and I know that because he's currently an Osher Fellow at the Exploratorium, and I hear about all the different things, amazing things he's doing. He worked with us, with his colleague Jonathan Cordero, also of the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, as advisors and guided our development of the Exploratorium land acknowledgement. Jonathan Young, our third speaker, worked as a volunteer and then intern at the Presidio while he got his master's at San Francisco State University, studying amphibian conservation and disease ecology. He was hired at the Presidio as the first dedicated staff member with a sole focus on wildlife. He developed the wildlife program, which includes surveying, monitoring, managing, and restoring the diversity of park animals. After the three speakers, we will also be joined by Lauren Stoneburner, also from San Francisco Estuary Institute and also involved in the project, and for our panel discussion. So with that, I turn it over to Robin.
Thank you, Susan. I'm so excited that you're all going to see the unveiling of Hidden Nature SF tonight. Thanks so much for coming. I fell in love with historical ecology while poring over maps of the Bay over 20 years ago, when I saw for the first time how piecing together these old maps and quotes and photographs into a picture of the former landscape can change the way you see a familiar place. It reveals another truth to the land, one that's hidden by the buildings and roads, a glimpse not just of the past, but of how we might shape the future as we think about the city we want to live in. So this land we're revealing was, of course, inhabited and shaped by indigenous Californians for thousands of years. And we're grateful tonight to have Greg Castro from the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, the original people of San Francisco Peninsula. And we're excited to have the rock star ecologist Jonathan Young from the Presidio Trust to talk about his work, his amazing work, bringing back the wildlife of this landscape. And thank you to Susan, Emma, Kael on tech, and the amazing Exploratorium for hosting and creating these conversations about landscape. I also want to thank Science Sandbox, an initiative of the Simons Foundation in New York, who supported this project with additional funding from the Seed Fund and the Google Ecology program. And now I'll introduce my colleague, Sean Baumgarten, who leads this project and all our historical ecology studies at SFEI. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Robin and Susan. My name is Sean Baumgarten, and I'm a historical ecologist at SFEI. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So this work that we're presenting tonight is the culmination of almost 3 years of work to uncover the natural history of San Francisco and to engage non-scientists in exploring the ecological past and hidden nature of their neighborhoods. My colleagues at SFEI and I, along with our colleagues at the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Presidio Trust, and other partners, have been working to unearth clues about what the landscape was like here before the city existed. We've now completed an interactive web map showing what the land looked like and the ecosystems that it supported. And we're launching the web map on our website tonight, along with in-depth stories exploring San Francisco's historical landscape and native peoples. And tonight I want to take you on a tour through that landscape and give you a glimpse back in time. So we'll look at some of the different ecosystems that existed here and the plants and animals they supported, and the natural forces that shaped the landscape. We'll also talk about how learning about San Francisco's past landscape can help people find the hidden nature that still lives within the city and imagine new ways of revitalizing the urban environment through planning, design, and community-level action. So what is historical ecology and why do we do it? Historical ecology is the use of historical data to study past landscapes and ecosystems. And one of the main motivations behind this research is to help us better understand the present landscape and to envision its future potential to support both people and native biodiversity. And in SFEI's Resilient Landscapes program, we've been conducting historical ecology studies all around California for over 2 decades. And we're now working to integrate historical ecology with findings from the science of urban ecology to provide landscape scale guidance for integrating more nature back into urban landscapes. So even though the landscape here has been transformed by the growth of San Francisco, there are still complex networks of hidden nature weaving through the city. And the more we can understand about how this landscape used to look and function, the better we can understand how to support nature here in the future. And this is a process of discovery that anyone can engage in. And in fact, one of our main goals in this project has been to inspire people to learn about and explore their landscapes, both in terms of its ecological history and the ways in which the landscape continues to support nature today. So back in the early stages of the project, pre-COVID, we got to do some historical ecology research with folks from the community. And we held a series of several workshops at the Exploratorium's Bay Observatory where we examined historical maps and talked with people about the process of historical ecology. And for me, that was definitely one of the highlights of the project. So the process of historical ecology is a bit like detective work. We're turning over different rocks, looking for clues, and piecing them together. And in this project, we looked at a wide range of different types of sources, from the descriptions of early explorers and other observers to early maps and surveys to landscape photographs and drawings. And this was actually one of the best documented parts of California by early observers, starting with the Spanish explorers in the late 1700s. So after the founding of the Presidio and the mission by the Anza expedition in 1776, San Francisco was visited by a number of early scientific and military expeditions. And naturalists on these expeditions made collections and landscape sketches and described the flora and fauna of the region. And many familiar species, like the California poppy, were first described from San Francisco at that time. And then with the gold rush starting in 1848, the population of San Francisco exploded. And this, of course, led to rapid transformation of the landscape. But it also gave us a number of accounts and depictions of the landscape just on the cusp of this radical change. And it's important to keep in mind that all of these sources that we're drawing on come from the perspective of the colonizers, as the native Ohlone left no written documents. And no single source has the complete picture, but by combining all of these different bits of information, we can reconstruct what the landscape used to look like and what plants and animals lived here. So the main result of the historical ecology research is this interactive web map, which we are launching on our website tonight, which shows the different habitat types and waterways that existed in San Francisco before the first Europeans set foot here. And for this first phase of the project, we focused on the northern portion of the city, and we'll be extending the map to the southern portion of the city in future phases. So each color on the map represents a different habitat type. And as you can see, this was a landscape with a surprising amount of ecological diversity. Overall, we were able to document 31 different types of habitats just within this portion of the peninsula, ranging from sand dunes and dune scrub to grasslands and wildflower fields to oak woodlands and chaparral to tidal marsh to a wide range of lakes and ponds and wetland habitats. And some of these habitats were quite unusual in the region, things like fens and dwarf coast live oak woodland and serpentine slope wetlands. And together they make San Francisco's historical landscape really unlike anything else that existed in California. So before we take a tour through this landscape, I want to first address the question, what made San Francisco's historical landscape so unique? And a large part of the answer is its unusual geography, as you can see in this map of the historical topography created by our partner Eric Sanderson and colleagues. So San Francisco sits at the end of a peninsula between the Pacific Ocean and the bay. So it's surrounded by water on three sides. And as a result, it has a very distinctive climate with cool summers, heavy fog cover, strong winds, and salt spray along the coastline. It sits at the foot of the Santa Cruz mountain range that runs north-south along most of the length of the peninsula. And it has a distinctive geology too. Porous and nutrient-poor dune sands cover much of the landscape, while outcroppings of serpentinite and other rocks in the Franciscan Formation extend across the peninsula. So in many ways, San Francisco was isolated from other parts of the Bay Area and was almost like an ecological island. And the plants and animals that lived here were adapted to survive under these unusual and, in many cases, harsh conditions. And so the landscape supported a unique and diverse flora and fauna. This was also a landscape inhabited by and stewarded by people. The indigenous people in San Francisco are referred to today as the Yalamu, which was a local tribal group of the Ramaytush Ohlone. And at the time of Spanish contact, it's estimated that there were about 160 Yalamu living in several village sites around present-day San Francisco. And the Yalamu used a wide variety of natural resources provided by the landscape, and also helped to shape and steward the landscape in important ways, as we'll see. So we'll begin our tour of the historical landscape with one of the city's most widespread and quintessential environments, its sand dunes. Today, San Francisco is so built up and paved over that it can be hard to imagine that so much of its area was covered by a sheet of sand, but sand dunes extended across much of the peninsula historically. And although early observers often described them as barren wastelands or complained about the nuisance of drifting sand, they in fact supported a rich diversity of different habitat types. The western part of the peninsula was dominated by a vast sheet of loose, sparsely vegetated dunes that shifted constantly with the winds. And this was an inhospitable environment for most plants, although hardy pioneer species like beach strawberry and beach evening primrose were able to survive here. Surprisingly, scattered through the dunes were a large number of ponds and wetlands, which occurred in low-lying areas supplied by groundwater. And these wetlands supported species like rushes and sedges, and even small trees like willow and Pacific wax myrtle. As you move further east across the peninsula, the dunes became more vegetated and less prone to shifting in the wind. These stabilized dunes supported diverse dune scrub and dune grassland communities, dominated by species like beach blue lupin and beach sagewort. Dune scrub and grassland provided habitat for a wide range of wildlife species like bobcats and black-tailed jackrabbits and California quail. These older dune soils also supported oak woodlands, and learning about these oak woodlands was a special discovery for our team because they weren't made up of the large oak trees that many of us are familiar with and so fond of. They were characterized by a dwarfed form of coast live oak, whose growth was stunted by a combination of strong winds, relatively infertile soils, and partial burial under shifting sands. So while coast live oak can reach massive proportions in other parts of its range, in San Francisco, it grew to just 10 to 15 feet high. And we actually had to piece together lots of information to reconstruct what San Francisco's oak woodlands looked like and where they occurred. Some of the old maps of San Francisco, like this Coast Survey map from 1857, show areas of tree cover, but we didn't know what kind of woodlands these were. And layering on other clues helped us to interpret the symbols shown on the maps. So one observer, for instance, wrote in 1857 that towards the Mission, the sandhills are covered in most places by a low growth of vegetation, principally shrubs and evergreen and dwarf oaks. And when we overlaid clues from textual descriptions of oak woodlands like this one, as well as early photographs on top of the map, we found that they corresponded to places where this tree symbol occurs. And so in that way, we were able to use other sources to help us interpret the symbol and then to map the oak woodlands. So while the sand dunes and the oak woodlands were prominent features of the landscape, there were also extensive areas covered by grasslands, coastal scrub, and other vegetation types. Coastal prairies and other grasslands in the region were characterized by perennial bunch grasses like purple needlegrass and California oatgrass, as well as a rich diversity of wildflowers, and provided habitat for wildlife like American badger, California ground squirrel, and horned lark. These coastal prairies often existed in a complex and dynamic mosaic with coastal scrub, which supported those shrubs like coyote brush and bush monkeyflower. And the dynamic nature of coastal prairie and coastal scrub made these habitat types particularly difficult to map because the boundaries between them were constantly changing through time. And so in some cases, we simply had to lump them together. Coastal prairies in the region are what we call disturbance dependent. So in many areas, they require frequent disturbances to persist. And in the absence of disturbances, they are often replaced by coastal scrub. And one of those disturbances was grazing. There were large herbivores like tule elk and mule deer that browsed on the woody plants and kept them from overtaking the grasslands. There were also periodic fires, many of which would have been set intentionally by the native Ohlone tribal groups to maintain open grasslands. We know that the Ohlone commonly used fire as a way to manage the landscape, to maintain more open habitats, and increase the abundance of edible plants and enhance habitat for game animals. For example, one observer in 1816 described how all night great fires burned on the back of the harbor, the natives are in the habit of burning the grass to further its growth. Some of the most distinctive habitat types in the historical landscape occurred in areas underlain by a type of rock called serpentinite. Soils derived from serpentinite are unusual. They're low in nutrients and high in elements that are toxic to many plants. And thus they support some very specialized plant and animal communities, including some that are almost entirely restricted to these serpentine environments. Maritime Chaparral is one of the plant communities often found in serpentine areas. It's characterized by species like manzanita and ceanothus, including some species that are endemic only to this portion of San Francisco. And in fact, some species like Raven's manzanita and Franciscan manzanita have been almost entirely eliminated from their natural range due to the city's urban transformation, and were even thought to be extinct until fairly recently. One particularly unusual serpentine plant community was found on the steep, landslide-prone coastal bluffs around Fort Point. Here, the cliffside was dotted with seeps and springs where groundwater emerged at the surface, so the drier serpentine maritime chaparral was intermixed with pockets of serpentine wetlands. And this was also an area exposed to the salt spray from the ocean, so there was a really unique combination of environmental conditions in this area that supported highly specialized plants. Paradoxically, despite being surrounded by water on three sides, water was hard to come by in many parts of the landscape. Rainwater quickly drained away through the porous sandy soils, and as a result, there were relatively few creeks. But that made the places where water did accumulate that much more important. And there were, in fact, a diversity of different wetland and riparian habitats scattered across the landscape, from the dune ponds and wetlands and serpentine wetlands we've discussed already, to wet meadows and willow groves, to ponds and lakes, and a number of places where water came to the surface through seeps and springs, as Joel Pomerantz has shown through his Seep City map. Ponds and lakes often occurred where beaches and dunes acted like a dam and cut off drainages, causing water to accumulate behind them. And some of these lakes held water year-round, like the relatively deep mountain lake in the Presidio, while others dried up during the summer. And lakes and ponds supported a huge diversity of wildlife species, from Pacific chorus frog to western pond turtle to freshwater mussels to a wide range of waterfowl and other birds. And while San Francisco didn't support major rivers, there were a number of smaller creeks and streams that fed San Francisco's otherwise parched landscape and were crucial sources of fresh water for wildlife. One of those was Lobos Creek, which drains the western side of the Presidio to the ocean, and which you can still visit today. Perhaps the most unusual habitat that existed in historical San Francisco was the fen, which existed within the present-day South of Market district in low-lying areas between dune ridges and along the borders of tidal marshes. And although I've been doing historical ecology for 10 years around the Bay Area, this was something I really wasn't expecting to find. Fens are characterized by waterlogged peat soils and have a very distinctive flora, with species like bog bean, marsh sandwort, and stream orchid. And this was probably the southernmost example of a fen on the entire west coast of North America. They're more commonly found in the subarctic and the Pacific Northwest. And in fact, one botanist described the fens in San Francisco as a kind of Arctic oasis amid a vegetation of California type. And in addition to this diversity of freshwater wetlands, areas along the shoreline supported salt marsh and other types of tidal wetlands. For example, this is an 1857 map showing the tidal wetlands around present-day Crissy Field. And tidal wetlands supported a wide range of shorebirds, waterfowl, and other wildlife. So over the years, modifications to the landscape have taken many forms. In the decades immediately following Spanish colonization, the Yelamu and the surrounding Ramaytush Ohlone were forced to assimilate and work in the mission system. Livestock were introduced, along with non-native and invasive plant species like wild oat and black mustard. Crops were planted to feed the populations at the Presidio and the Mission, and oak woodlands were cut for firewood. A cascade of changes followed the start of the gold rush as the rapidly growing city expanded outwards. Urban development covered over the native habitats. Even the shape of the shoreline changed, as you can see in this map from 1851, as Shallow Bay was filled and the surrounding sandhills were leveled. On the western side of the peninsula, efforts began in the late 1800s to stabilize the sand dunes by planting non-native beach grass and trees like eucalyptus. And this eventually led to the creation of Golden Gate Park. Amazingly, a swath of the original dune field persisted in the Sunset District into the mid-20th century, as you can see here, but that was eventually leveled and developed as well. So the landscape of San Francisco has been forever transformed, and today's city bears little resemblance to the land once dominated by sand dune habitats and dwarf coast live oaks. And the loss of natural habitats has, of course, had major impacts on the plants and animals that lived here, and many species that existed here historically have been eliminated. Some of these species, like the Xerces blue butterfly, have even gone extinct. However, there is still a natural ecosystem to explore and remnants of the historical habitats that have persisted amid the centuries of change. Small groves of dwarf coast live oak still exist in Golden Gate Park and Buena Vista Park, and remnant patches of dune scrub still exist in places like the Presidio. And historical ecology gives us a new way to understand and connect with these natural areas in the city today. It also helps us imagine what the potential of the city might be in the future. What types of plants and animals could we bring back? What habitat types are most likely to thrive in different parts of the city? Where might we be able to restore habitats like sand dunes or oak woodlands, or at least elements of them? Where are there opportunities to connect up existing habitat patches and create wildlife corridors? So in this urban environment that's been so fundamentally modified, building ecological resilience relies on restoring elements of these native ecosystems and their functioning, as well as restoring people's connection to the city's natural landscape. And an understanding of the historical ecology of the city gives us insights into how we can fold some of these elements back into our urban system going forward. A number of areas have already been restored and revitalized using historical ecology as a foundation. The Presidio Trust, for instance, has been working for decades to restore a wide range of habitats, from riparian areas in Tennessee Hollow to tidal marsh near Kissy Field. Nature in the City has been working to restore a corridor of dune habitats in the inner Sunset to support the green hairstreak butterfly. A number of other agencies are working to restore native habitats in San Francisco. And these efforts are making a difference for wildlife, as we'll hear from Jonathan a little bit later. And in addition to restoring larger open spaces, there are many actions that can be undertaken by both residents and agencies at all different scales to make the city a healthier and more biodiverse place. They include planting street trees, landscaping yards and schools with native plants, creating green roofs, designing green stormwater infrastructure, and so on. And these types of actions not only support biodiversity, but also provide other important benefits like flood risk reduction, improved water quality, heat resilience, and resilience to sea level rise. And to help plan and prioritize urban greening efforts in a strategic way, SFEI recently created the Urban Biodiversity Framework, which outlines the fundamental elements that are needed to support a healthy and functioning urban ecosystem. And these include things like large habitat patches, connections between patches, habitat diversity, and native vegetation. And understanding how the natural landscape functioned before major modifications through historical ecology helps us start out the elements that are needed to bolster ecosystem functioning and nature-based solutions in the city today. So our hope is that the next time you're out walking in the city, this glimpse into the historical landscape will inspire you to look for the hidden nature that can still be found throughout San Francisco, and to imagine how we can bring more nature back into our urban realm. And to learn more about San Francisco's historical ecology, you can now find the interactive web map and other content live on our website, hidden-nature.org. And this is also compatible with mobile platforms, so you can pull the map up as you're out exploring the city. And we're looking forward to continuing this effort and expanding the historical ecology mapping to other portions of the city in future phases of the project. You can also follow us on Twitter and sign up for our Hidden Nature SF email list. And I want to conclude with a big thank you to all of our partners and science advisors for all of your invaluable contributions to this project. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Greg Castro.
Rishatuhi. Greetings to you in the Ramaytush dialect of the Ohlone people. My name is Greg Castro, and among other things, I'm the culture director for the Association for Ramaytush Ohlone, and I'm very happy and honored to be here tonight and to be a part of this project. It is near and dear to our hearts and to our culture and heritage. The idea of for Native people that they come into the world in a special place for a purpose. That place was given to them to be their place to take care of. Concepts of ownership, possession, really don't apply in the same way for Native culture. We are often told in our stories that we are the youngest. We are the last among living beings. We are the kids of the family. So if you've grown up in a family of many people in it, hopefully you came into a situation where your family's established, your parents have figured out how to parent and put food on the table, and you have a nice place to live, and older siblings perhaps to annoy you and bug you and take care of you. And our stories kind of tell a similar story for us, that we were brought into the world that was created by Creator and given over to the first people, what we refer to as the first people. Those are the animal and plant relatives that were here before us, and they were shaped by the leaders of the first people to be in the place they were meant to be, and in a way that supported each other, and therefore were meant to be taken care of so that everyone could benefit from it. And that is the way we were brought into the world, and we lived for thousands of years. Archaeology says we've been here for over 10,000. Our stories say we've been here since near the dawn of time. And throughout that time period, we have been told we belong here. And it is our sacred obligation and duty and commitment to continue to take care of this place so it'll take care of us. So as we say in modern terms, we are committed to taking care of the land and all the living things on it. And although the ancestors that taught us that lesson may not have perceived and foresaw this many newcomers coming in and these many changes, those commands for us to take care of the place still apply, and we have not forgotten them. Although the struggle to maintain that has been quite a challenge the last 250 years. Sean mentioned earlier about some of our relatives who were near extinction, the animal relatives that we hardly see anymore, the plant relatives that are near extinction, and really the relatives, meaning the people relatives also who were near extinction, our Ramaytush relatives. There are very few that survived the colonization period. And as tragic that is, it's also tragic for the land, because there was no one who remembered how to take care of it. And so the landscape was radically changed. And we saw this through the pictures that Sean showed, that the landscape has changed. And of course, he was showing during most of the historical period, just the last 200 years or so. But it's changed much more radically in the last 10,000 years. I like to remind people that the islands you see down in the bay, like Alcatraz Island, weren't always islands. You could walk to Oakland. You could walk to the Farallones at one point. The seashore was more than a mile out west from where it is now. So these landscapes have been important to remember that. There are many layers to that history that is there, many mysteries that are lying below the surface below us. And of course, many of our relatives are theirs too. And so we always want to remember that, that there's a lot of life underneath us, not just memories, not just history, but life. And we want to honor and respect that. And one way we can do it is by understanding it. And that's why this project is so important to us and vital to the understanding of what was here before us, and to allow us to remember and to educate the public, whether they've been here for a while or newcomers, to the history of this place and how it needs to be taken care of. We understand from the vast changes all across the state and from our relatives in other tribal communities that there are many tools that we learned over the many generations on how to take care of our homelands. And each place was unique. And so the tools to take care of them are unique. And that's really what's important about this project, is the fine detail, the microbiology, the microenvironments involved all across this landscape along the peninsula and the Ramaytush homeland. And a lot of those microclimates still exist today. And even though a lot of it has been built over, a lot of that knowledge can still apply and is still very important to bring forward. And at least for people to remember and to have an appreciation of what happened. But also, not just because it's historical, it's happened to somebody else some long time ago, but a lot of that historical information, whether it's ecological, biological, or other sciences or other knowledge bases, they apply today and they inform today. And a lot of the structure of our society, whether it's legal or administrative or social, is built upon those understandings, whether we remember them or not. But I think it's very important to remember them because they inform us on how we can do better. And I think what nature is telling us right now is we need to do a lot better in how we interact with it and how we take care of the place that we've been given to enjoy and to live, and that supports us on a daily basis. So this has been a really wonderful project to bring that knowledge back and have people remember in a new and dynamic way. And that's what's fascinating about working with the Estuary Institute and with Exploratorium, the incredible tools that they bring to the table to bear to bring this out to the public. And you saw a little bit of that, what Sean showed on the screen, and you're going to see more on the website and more to come, and more from the Exploratorium as well as we work with them to bring out different facets of the long history, the very long history of human existence in Yelamu here in the San Francisco Peninsula. Thank you for listening to me.
All right. Let me just share my screen here. Looks like it's already up, and start the slideshow. Hope everybody can hear me all right. Let me get this going. Hope that's working all right. And here we go. So everybody, hi. My name is Jonathan Young, Pursuer Trust Wildlife Ecologist. Thank you all for inviting me and to add a little bit to this really exciting project. And I'm going to talk a lot about, or at least a little bit about, some of the applications of this historical ecology and looking at currently what's happening, but also projecting a little bit into the future, thinking about what's going to be happening in the Presidio in the future. And you can see here the city, obviously the city we know and love. the Presidio back there, the big green blob right up against the Golden Gate's south side. It's a 1,500-acre former military base turned national park in the late 1990s. And the military really did a number on degrading the habitat. But in fact, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because they actually prevented the total, complete loss of some of San Francisco's last remaining remnant habitat. So the Presidio Trust, federal agency that manages the majority of the Presidio, has many goals, but some of our goals focusing on natural resource conservation are to increase and sustain ecosystem health. And me specifically, I'm looking at it through the lens of wildlife. So applying science and historical ecology to achieving that. So here's an example of one of our restoration sites. This is a creek that was actually put underground by the military to create this landfill/shooting range. And so using historical ecology concepts and techniques, we've been able to, first off, identify where that was and reshape a meandering creek and replant it with a lot of the riparian native plants that would have been found in that area. Well, this is what we call it daylighting a creek. This is now a thriving landscape full of a variety of native plants and the insects and the birds that require this type of habitat to thrive. So there are many examples. This is just one of many to see in real time in the Presidio. But of course, not all the Presidio habitats can be, quote, restored to some historic resemblance. And in fact, some of these eucalyptus forests are non-native, but they are protected historically with federal mandates as a historic character of the Presidio. So they will be managed as such in perpetuity. But we all know they don't really support too much wildlife. However, there are ways to experiment with shade-tolerant native plants to enhance the wildlife resources in these understories. So working within the framework of some of these constraints in our modern-day Presidio landscape, because again, a lot of these forests, they're not going anywhere. They are protected and they will stay that way. So what can we do to improve them? Experimenting, and we're getting some really good results with that. And as was already mentioned, a lot of different species of animals were lost over the centuries across the peninsula. But a lot actually were able to hang on some of these little patches of remnant habitat. And through our restoration and forest enhancements, we've actually been able to increase the diversity and abundance of a lot of our smaller, more obscure creatures. The green hair streak, the green butterfly there is fairly uncommon in San Francisco, but fairly common in the Presidio, as well as the Ackman blue butterflies right there in the middle. You don't really find them elsewhere throughout San Francisco because the habitat is gone, except for in the Presidio. We've been enhancing and expanding that habitat. And I like to think the general rule for restoration ecology, generally speaking, is if you build it, they will come. If they can get there and there's a source nearby, they're going to find that if it's high quality habitat. That's what we've been seeing in the Presidio. And of course, up the food chain we go. We've seen a lot of our native birds start to increase in abundance and diversity through this positive cascading effects of our bottom-up restoration. So restoring the vegetation brings in the insects and the vegetation provide the resources to support bird avian diversity. And our long-term monitoring is starting to show this with statistical significance, actually. So again, if you build it, they will come. But what about the species that cannot come back on their own? As some of the themes that we've talked about in the other two talks is this idea of islands. Presidio, you can really think of it as an isolated island relative to whatever animal you're talking about, because of course, a lot of birds and coyotes, for example, can get to the Presidio no problem, but a lot of these smaller, more obscure creatures cannot. So it is an isolated island to some extent. Some of these animals that were lost cannot come back on their own. So using historical ecology techniques to understand what species were here, why are they gone, and can they come back? So have we restored the habitat enough to bring them back and to support them? What were the drivers of decline? Have we identified them? Have we addressed them? Or is there something else that we can do to try to bring them back? So again, applying a lot of these concepts to historical ecology, to current times, and looking out into the future as well. So I like to think of the Presidio's chapter over the last couple of years as Wildlife Restoration 2.0, intentionally reintroducing species that were lost, locally extinct, or extirpated through reintroductions, which is intentionally bringing back an extirpated, locally extinct species from which it historically ranged. Again, this is an intentional movement of lost species. So we started some of these that I'll be able to touch on briefly. Is one of the first ones that we've had major success with is the butterfly on the right, the variable checker spot butterfly, last seen in the late 1970s. And as we restored its habitat, coastal scrub, we've now been able to reintroduce this butterfly, and it is thriving throughout the coastal scrub habitat of the Presidio. Same goes with the California ringlet, a classic grassland species. As we've restored the very small fragments of serpentine grasslands, we are now in the process of reintroducing the California ringlet. We started this year. So too soon to say success, but I got a good feeling about that one. Another one that's everybody loves is the western pond turtle. The one and only natural lake in the Presidio, Mountain Lake, has been undergoing drastic restoration over the last really 20 years, but really the last 7 years has really been pushing hard restoration in the lake itself. And we've brought back this pond turtle several years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, and they are finally at the age of where they're starting to reproduce on their own. That little tiny quarter-sized turtle was born this year. So evidence of reproduction and new generation is key for sustaining wildlife through the future. Of course, amphibians, a lot of amphibians were lost as we lost a lot of wetlands and degraded lakes and creeks. Amphibians like this chorus frog used to be very common throughout San Francisco. Now we're on the verge of local extinction, but now the Presidio has really taken hold with this species. But this is something that's really important because as we restore wetlands, we're really starting to see the impacts of climate change and drought, specifically over the last 3 years. So these aquatic species it's going to be really hard times ahead, and we're going to have to make some really interesting decisions about how we continue to manage these aquatic species. Another classic aquatic species, this is a damselfly. It's related to a dragonfly, a little bit smaller. This is one of the rarest damselflies in North America. And it is a predator, so it's actually really cool to have around because they can control mosquitoes. And that's another thing we want to think about when we're talking about wildlife in urban areas is how do you manage healthy ecosystems, and in particular, healthy for checks and balances for things like pest species that could impact human health, like mosquitoes. So we want to have these aquatic predators to help us keep things like mosquitoes in check. We would call that an ecosystem service. I'll show another example, but this is one of the rarest damselflies. So as we create and restore its habitat, like wetlands, perennial wetlands, we're able to bring back this rare damselfly. Another classic ecosystem service providers is freshwater mussel, California floater mussel. These are very rare. They're overlooked and underrated. They are really the heroes of water quality because they are filter feeders. They're little biological feeders, little biological filters that are continuously cleaning the water. And they've actually improved water clarity, but they also have been shown to remove E. coli and other things from the water. So again, an ecosystem service, it's actually promoting the health and cleanliness of our environments, clean water. We can all really understand and appreciate clean water in this day and age. This is a really interesting one that we've been working on with some brilliant scientists over at SFEI. The California quail, the city and the state bird, went locally extinct in this county about 13 years ago or so. It's a very complex project with a lot of moving parts. The landscape, since it has gone locally extinct, has changed dramatically. So now we're in the stages of asking, can we actually bring this back, and what would it entail? So we're working with these scientists using some pretty sophisticated mathematical modeling to ask these questions and address some of the issues that led to its decline, and understand what have we done and what can we do to actually bring back this quail, this species. And actually, these scientists are providing us with some really great, high quality information that's helping the planning of this reintroduction project. For example, how many quail would you actually need to reintroduce over how many different years to actually jumpstart a sustainable population of this bird? And even more broadly, thinking about this project, how can we connect the Presidio to some of our larger patches of potential quail habitat? So promoting and enhancing movement corridors so that these animals, like these ground nesting birds that don't fly very well, they need to move basically on the ground. Of course, there's a lot of traffic, so something to consider. How do you connect these larger patches across our dense city? And then just ending here, the future is interesting. It's exciting, but it's also uncertain because, as I mentioned, we're seeing some real firsthand manifestations of our changing climate, with drought in particular. and how that's starting to cascade through the system. And we're starting to come across and up against some really important management questions about how we manage some of these landscapes. But stepping back a little bit, again, talking about our primary goals of continuing to enhance ecological health through biodiversity enhancement and increasing that biodiversity, promoting public awareness and connectivity and understanding and appreciation of our biological resources, and really getting people to understand that healthy ecosystems can provide tangible benefits: clean water, clean air, mental health, physical health. We all understand that now, especially after the COVID lockdowns. A lot of people were out and about exploring their urban nature. And I think more and more people are really starting to appreciate this. So again, bringing this conservation to an urban audience is one of the biggest components of this national park right in the middle of our city. So I will end it there, and thank you so much.
So I think we're bringing everyone back now for a discussion. Thank you so much for those great presentations. One of my first questions is a little bit more about how actually did you work together? We've done another presentation like this, and people kind of speak from their own perspectives, and I know when the story maps were finished, we all chimed in on what made sense. But Sean, could you talk a little bit about, what would, maybe a little bit the work with Eric Sanderson, or how did you work with the Presidio? There's so many resources and people there. Jonathan's work is just incredible. And I know more recently you've been working with Greg and Jonathan from the Ramaytush Ohlone. So I wonder if you could talk about, did you all get together? Did you just pass things on the web? I know with COVID, it's been very hard, but it'd be nice to know how the collaboration worked.
Yeah, this was a very collaborative process, and we really couldn't have done it ourselves. So, we're super appreciative of all of our partners, and worked closely with Jonathan and Lou and Damien and others at the Presidio Trust throughout the project. They really helped from the outset with providing access to lots of great data sets, historical data sets that they had already compiled over many years. And thinking about some of the particular management questions that they had that they felt historical ecology could help inform. Likewise, working with Eric Sanderson and colleagues at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Eric, if you don't know, is the author of Mannahatta, Historical Ecology of New York, an amazing work. And so just many insights and lots of great advice and guidance for us in this process. And then more recently, working with Greg and Jonathan has, we're really fortunate to have been able to work with them and benefit from their knowledge and just helping sort of understand the cultural component of the historical landscape, that this was a cultural landscape, and sort of all the implications along with that. So there's many other partners and folks that we've worked with, too many to name here beyond this list, but yeah, it's really a great resource for us.
I don't know if anyone else has a comment about, things you learn from each other that you didn't expect, perhaps, that might be interesting for our listeners to know about. I do have a question here, though, from our listeners, and it is, aside from the Presidio, what are some other successful restoration projects locally? What are the ingredients for a successful restoration project, and how can people get involved? How can we really extend this to a broader public in the Bay Area?
I could take a stab at that. That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's so many different scales of restoration. The Presidio is probably, the most ambitious in San Francisco, with, Crissy Field and Mountain Lake and just a lot of different pieces of the puzzle. But Things come to mind like Pier 98 and Heron's Head Park and some of the stuff going on the south side of the city with beaches and some of the Bayside wetland restoration. And then within the urban setting, much smaller projects that are still doing what Sean and Jonathan and folks talked about, of bringing back some of the native plants and some, smaller versions of the plant communities and then the insects and birds that support those on, say, a green roof, at Cal Academy, or in bioretention projects, green infrastructure projects that SFPUC is doing, or people in their backyard. I've seen amazing pictures through this project that people have shared with us of essentially dune restoration in people's backyards out in the western parts of the city, where they realize they have sands and they realize they could be actually drawing on the native plant palette. So I think, I don't know if it's really even documented, but if you looked across the city, I'm sure there's sort of a gradual outpouring of these kinds of efforts. And that's what we're starting to talk about, is how if these start adding up and connecting and are informed by a deeper vision and kind of commitment to care and stewardship of the land, they could really start adding up and making a, more holistic restoration. And, to answer the question, what are the ingredients? I mean, I think the three ingredients are understanding the past, understanding what supported the kinds of systems you're trying to create, and then the present, what's possible and what do you need to do, like what Jonathan does, where they're moving earth sometimes, or, clearing out some previous vegetation. So like, what do you do today? And then there is the support and care and stewardship and commitment. Like, people have to care about it and want to take care of it and really, be committed to that over time, so that you shape it, either whether it's in your yard, or a bigger project in a neighborhood, or, a park.
And Greg also mentioned something I know we muse about at the Exploratorium, which is that longer term thinking. I mean, we're in a drought now. We have been for many years, but we understand that our landscape here has been in many droughts historically, tens, thousands of years ago. And so I wonder, how do we get people to understand the time frame we're in is really very short, and that the work we need to do is longer term thinking? I don't know, Greg, do you want to talk a little bit more about how do you build that understanding in the way you think about the future of our place in the Bay Area?
Well, that may be the magic question, because I think for Native people, it's kind of inherent in the culture that we build in. When I talk to people and they talk about long ago, they're talking about the 1860s. And for me, long ago is when we could walk to Oakland and see our relatives on the East Bay, 6,000 plus years ago. So it's a matter of perspective, I think, and understanding the landscape, and that there were people here that understood the landscape at each moment in time, and that it was a dynamic landscape that changed. And I think that's what we're now seeing, a willingness for modern science to understand that particular part of the perspective, to not assume that they already know. And I think, especially with climate change, the current landscape conditions here in California, they're coming to that conclusion because it's almost hitting them over the head. They really thought they knew, and they may not know everything they need to know. And where are they going to get that information? Well, a lot of it is in the ground itself, and looking at it in new ways, looking at archaeology, ethnobotany, the sciences of anthropology, and asking the people that have been here for a long time, because I may look kind of old, but I haven't been here that long. But our people have been here for 10,000 years. There have been people in this state, in this landscapes, for thousands and thousands of years, and it's a continuous string of culture that has passed the information along. And if you've been in a place, like you grew up in San Francisco, and you are in the house that you maybe grew up in, or that's still in your family, you could maybe turn out the lights and walk around and not hit anything, right? That's just from your childhood to now. You have that intimate knowledge of place. Then imagine a people that have been here for thousands and thousands of years and have an intimate daily connection to that place and see it change continually and are adapting to it as they go along. And I think that's the part that is really changing nowadays about Native being taught about Native people, that we were not a static, savage group of people that just got plopped here by accident and enjoyed the bounty of the landscape. We were co-conspirators with the landscape in making it the best possible for all of us. And we learned a lot of things along the way. And a lot of that knowledge is still possible to access. And what's really exciting is to combine it with these new modern tools that, especially things like, displaying of landscape in different ways, including hopefully at some point in a 3D way to show it in a very dynamic way, how it's changed, but in how in some ways the fundamentals are still there and we can still grasp them and maintain them and steward them.
And I have I have one last question here from the audience, because we're kind of out of time just about. But I think maybe Lauren and Jonathan might have a comment here. What is phase 2 of this project, and how do people get involved? Are there ways in the Presidio? I know there's volunteer groups. You can even do outdoor archaeology. I think there is just a normal citizen. But Lauren, what is the next phase for Hidden SF?
Yeah, so we, like Sean was saying, we've posted an interactive web map and several stories on our website. So those are live now. And so you can go through those, and the interactive web map is meant to be a tool where you can explore the landscapes, sort of tour it at your own pace. And the stories are more of a curated narrative that take a deeper dive into several topics. And so going forward, we have a project called Next Generation Urban Greening, where we are continuing to do historical ecology in the Southeast San Francisco. And we are directly applying what we learned from the historical ecology to urban greening strategies and implementation projects on the ground. And so to get involved, I would say just stay tuned. We have a sign up link on our website where you can stay tuned for more information and also just browse our resources. Sean or Robin, is there anything you would add?
Well, I just note, you may notice we have done the northern half of the city, and we are hoping to keep going and finish the southern half. And we have some proposals out there, and we are looking for resources to continue that project. And if once we get that funded, we will then hopefully continue this sort of public engagement and participation in shaping that picture and putting it together and figuring out what it means. So we hope to continue that in different ways, shapes, and forms. And as Lauren said, through a number of different projects too, where we're starting to apply the information. And I think now that it's online, people can do that themselves. They can, look at that information. We've put a bunch of resources too of other groups in the city that can have resources where you can, to help see what you might get involved in and how you can kind of contribute to bringing the landscape some of these characteristics back. Mm-hmm. So yeah, please look at those resources, get involved with the Presidio, the Ramaytush events that are starting to happen, and participate in the project as it moves forward. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan, did you have anything to add about next steps at the Presidio? Your work is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really exciting things happening right now with wildlife restoration, and some definitely going to be coming down in the next couple of years, like the quail. And then in terms of involvement, I mean, we're finally starting to reopen our volunteer programs, which is great. And that's where I got my start here in the park. And anybody could come down. It's a great way to get dirty, to get off trail, sanctioned off trail, into some really special places that you otherwise wouldn't get to see, to meet the community, to learn your native plants, to learn your non-native plants, and to learn some of these techniques and to actually do these techniques of land management. It's a great opportunity. There's other opportunities. There are archaeology opportunities. There's docent opportunities. So if you're into history, if you're into natural history, if you're into all of that, presidio.gov. Check out the webpage. There's a lot of information.
Well, thank you again, all of you tonight. We were delighted to work with SFEI on the Hidden Nature Project, and we still have those big posters floating around that we made, and got some ideas for some exhibits maybe too. So thank you all so much, and please check out their website and see the story maps. Also, take a look at the Presidio's website. They're always having activities, and soon a field station will open the end of this year or early next year, the public field station, for learning about what they're doing over there. And keep your eye on our website too. We do more programs like this, and soon Greg and his colleague Canyon Sears Rhodes, who are both OSHA fellows with the Exploratorium, will be doing some public programs. One on Saturday, October 16th at 2 p.m. Called Ask a Native, and tune in to find out what that's all about. And then we'll be doing it again Thursday, November 4th in the evening during our evening programming. And so we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you again, all of you in the audience, for coming tonight. And we'll see you soon. Good night.